With Echoes of Wisdom seeming to open the doors to a new era of Grezzo-led top-down Zeldas, it has been a long time since the Capcom Zelda era. And yet, for a long time, this short period gave us some of the greatest hits in the Zelda series, from the expansive and ambitious Oracles games to the experimental Four Swords and the beautiful Minish Cap, which to this day is held by many as a high watermark for Zelda presentation, particularly in the top-down games. But since 2004's Minish Cap, things were destined to change, with one fateful decision by the Capcom senior management having a ripple effect that has shaped the Zelda series ever since. In this video, we're going to explore the fate of the Capcom developers. And the first thing I'm going to do is blow up the idea that a Capcom Zelda team existed discreetly at all. By rights, we should probably refer to the developer that made the titles on behalf of Capcom, and these were not Capcom themselves, but a small group called Flagship Company Limited. Flagship was always an eccentric idea. Created by Capcom, Nintendo, and Sega jointly in 1997, their early games were exclusive Sega Saturn RPGs, which never released due to that system's premature demise. The company had a track record through the early noughties of working particularly on Resident Evil games, but there was a group under the directorship of a young Hidemaru Fujibayashi who went on to create the 2D Zelda titles. I actually have a fuller deep dive on the specifics of how all this went down, which I will link to at the end, but for our purposes now, we really want to know what happened to this team of developers. At first, it came down to simple old restructuring. Capcom wanted to reabsorb Flagship, and so the ship sank. Many returned to their old base at Capcom. Hidemaru Fujibayashi made the hugely consequential decision to join the Zelda team as a full member, and after a brief tilt at supporting on Phantom Hourglass, he has been the director of every mainline 3D Zelda since 2011. But what of all the rest of that core Flagship team? First of all, then, let's see if there is any Capcom band to reassemble, or Flagship band to reassemble. After all, if there's nobody left at Capcom with any connection to the old Nintendo team, then there's nothing that particularly favours Nintendo partnering with Capcom over any number of other possible studios. As I covered on my video on the great man himself, director of the 3 Zelda games Hidemaru Fujibayashi left Capcom and has now been the director for all of those Zelda games since Skyward Sword, Breath of the Wild, and Tears of the Kingdom. He did stay at Capcom for a long time, but eventually made the jump in the mid-2000s and is now very much a Nintendo mainstay. So let's start by looking at the group of people who are in the engine room of the games, the planning team at Flagship's Zelda group. In terms of trajectories, there is a big mix for what happened to them afterwards. Shigeki Morihira, Takashi Hamamura, and Sukol Lee all ended up at HAL. Hamamura-san hasn't had a credit since 2017's Kirby Battle Royale, and Sukol Lee left a planning lead on Kirby Mass Attack for HAL before heading to Sony as a planning lead for The Last Guardian in 2016. Neither have had credits in the last few years. Shigeki Morihira, on the other hand, has been absent since 2006's Kirby Squeak Squad, and since that title was nearly 2 decades ago and his first credit was in 1992's legendary Super NES title Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles: Turtles in Time, there is a fair chance he is approaching retirement if he's even still working in the games industry at all. Minoru Nakai has stayed with Capcom working on Mega Man, Resident Evil, and Professor Layton, although hasn't produced a game since a special thanks credit on Dead Rising 2. Yuki Tsukada, another planner, hasn't had credits since Zelda. So out of that core planning team, most did not follow Hidemaru Fujibayashi to Nintendo, although those at HAL are perhaps a little closer given HAL's historic closeness to the Big N. However, many don't seem to be actively in the gaming space at all. Looking at the other teams, it's actually easier to identify the people who did join Nintendo than those who didn't. Takayuki Nakayama spent some time working on games as diverse as Advance Wars, Days of Ruin, Pokemon Rangers, Shadow of Alma, and Kirby Mass Attack, before coming home to Capcom as ultimately the director of Street Fighter VI. Hiroyuki Imahori also moved to work on Pokemon spin-offs, but a fair bit later. Finally, Yasushi Adachi worked at Nintendo for a period of time, particularly producing Kirby and the Amazing Mirror and helping on Fire Emblem The Sacred Stones. However, his last Nintendo credit was on Kirby Mass Attack, and he's been working for a range of companies since, including SNK and Marvelous. Of the programming team for Minish Cap, it's actually striking that almost everyone remained at Capcom for long periods. Not all have worked on titles since 2015, although a number are on Street Fighter VI or have been attached to Phoenix Wright Ace Attorney. All told, there is still a surprising number of people at Capcom, but those with any recent credits have now moved on to quite significant titles. It's not clear whether the director of Street Fighter VI would want to partner with Nintendo again on another 2D Zelda, or indeed any Zelda project. Smaller games like this at bigger companies feel like the preserve of younger teams, and those teams would inevitably require more shepherding from the folks at Nintendo EPD, who in any event would probably want to have a strong hand on the tiller anyway. However, in this case, why would Nintendo not simply turn to their more recent development bedfellows Grezzo, or even the developers of Twilight Princess and Skyward Sword remasters, Tantalus? After all, Eiji Aonuma as good as confirmed that Grezzo will be working on further 2D Zeldas. There is one other theory that might preclude further joint ventures with Capcom. While Link's Awakening was remade on Switch, the Capcom games were simply transported as is onto the Nintendo Switch online service. You can't read too much into the decision to simply not port a game, especially when the Switch already has amazing 2D Zelda games to its name, but nevertheless, if they had any instinct to remake these games in the near future, I feel like they would have held them back. This is certainly what happened with Super Mario RPG. The thing with Capcom games is that because of the co-development arrangement, presumably the profits would be shared too. If the contracts did not foresee remakes down the track, there are legal issues to be ironed out, and even if the contracts did foresee such an event, Nintendo may not want to go to all the effort of remaking a game only to have to split the profits at the back end. Therefore, my hunch is that remakes of these games, as much as they are complete classics, are very unlikely, less than 10% chance before the end of 2028. But Nintendo are not averse to joint ventures. Look at Ubisoft's Mario plus Rabbids titles or Sega's Mario plus Sonic at the Olympics. The fact is, though, that Nintendo's relationship with Capcom just hasn't been that close in recent years. They did clear their schedule for the month of March 2021 for the release of Monster Hunter's Rise, which was a major exclusive for them and a massive game in Japan particularly. That was doubtless a profitable venture for both Nintendo and Capcom, and I don't for a second think that their business relationship is anything other than broadly cordial. Still, whereas Nintendo published Octopath Traveler for Square, and for that matter actually have shares in Konami, Square Enix, and Koei Tecmo, Capcom remains independent of Nintendo's orbit, and many of their titles are focused on other consoles. If you would be interested in me doing more deep dives on Capcom content, at least as it relates to Nintendo, please do let me know in the comments below, and in the meantime, why not check out my video on Hidemaru Fujibashi for the full detail behind what happened at Flagship. Thank you for watching, thank you so much to my Patreon supporters, and I will see you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.